A single message could win or lose a battle. A single intercepted word could cost thousands of lives. In the Pacific War, the United States was locked in a desperate struggle against an enemy that was brilliant at breaking codes. Every time the Americans created a new cipher, the Japanese cracked it. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse. But the Americans had a secret weapon. It was not a machine, it was not a complex mathematical formula. It was a language, an ancient, unwritten language spoken by a people who had been in North America for centuries. The Navajo language became the basis for the most successful military code in modern history. It was never broken, not once. It helped win some of the most brutal battles of the war, from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima. More than 400 Navajo men served as code talkers with the U.S. Marine Corps. They could send and receive messages in seconds that would take code machines 30 minutes to process. Their work was flawless, fast, and completely secure. So how did this happen? How did a language that the U.S. government once tried to eradicate become the very thing that helped save it? What made these men and their mother tongue an unbeatable weapon? The story is more complex and more human than you might think. Number 17, what if one man had never listened to the radio? It all started with a man named Philip Johnston. He was not a military strategist. He was not a cryptographer. He was a civil engineer, the son of a missionary, but he had something no one in the Pentagon had. He grew up on the Navajo Nation. He played with Navajo children. He learned their language. He understood their culture. He knew the language was incredibly complex. It had sounds and grammatical rules that existed almost nowhere else on Earth. To an outsider, it sounded like a random collection of noises. In early 1942, Johnston was living in California. He was too old to enlist, but he wanted to help the war effort. One day, he read a newspaper story about a military unit in Louisiana. They were using Comanche soldiers to send secure messages. The idea was simple. If the enemy intercepted the message, they would just hear a language they did not understand. It was a clever tactic, but Johnston saw a flaw. There were not that many Comanche speakers, and German academics had studied many Native American languages before the war. It was possible, even likely, that the enemy had someone who could understand it. Johnston knew Navajo was different. It was spoken by thousands, so there was a large pool of potential recruits, but almost no non-Navajos could speak it. There were no books on Navajo grammar. The language had never been fully written down. He believed it could be the perfect code. On February 27, 1942, Johnston drove to Camp Elliott, a Marine Corps base near San Diego. He walked into the office of Lieutenant Colonel James E. Jones. He pitched his idea. Imagine the scene. A middle-aged civilian walks into a busy military base during wartime. He tells a senior officer that an ancient, unwritten language is the key to winning the war. Most people would have laughed him out of the room. But the Marines were desperate. Their codes were being broken. They were losing men. They were willing to listen to anything. Lieutenant Colonel Jones was skeptical, but Johnston was persistent. He offered to prove it. A few weeks later, on February 28th, the Marines brought in 4 Navajo men from the Los Angeles area. They set up a test. They gave the Navajos a series of typical combat messages, things like enemy machine gun nest on your right flank, and send reinforcements. The Navajos translated them into their language. They transmitted them over a field radio to another Navajo on the other side of the base. The message was translated back into English. It was perfect, and it was fast. Major General Clayton B. Vogel was the commanding general of the Amphibious Corps Pacific Fleet. He saw the demonstration. He was a practical man, not prone to wild ideas, but what he saw that day convinced him. The speed was incredible. The security seemed absolute. On March 6, 1942, just a week after the test, Vogel wrote a letter to the Commandant of the Marine Corps. He recommended recruiting 200 Navajos to be trained as communications specialists. He wrote, "The Navajo language is a secret code in itself." He called it a priceless military asset. The idea was approved. The Marine Corps sent recruiters to the Navajo Nation. They were looking for young, healthy men who were fluent in both Navajo and English. They found them. The war of words was about to change. It all happened because one man, Philip Johnston, had a strange childhood, read a newspaper, and refused to be ignored. His idea, born from a life spent between two worlds, set in motion one of the most remarkable stories of the war. What if Johnston had been 5 minutes later and Lieutenant Colonel Jones was out to lunch? What if General Vogel had been a less imaginative man and dismissed the idea as ridiculous? How many other brilliant, unconventional ideas were lost during the war simply because the right person was not there to listen at the right time? Number 16. Why were the men who saved the code the same men the government tried to silence? The first group of recruits were 29 young Navajo men. They came from places like Shiprock, Tuba City, and Window Rock. They were sheep herders, farmers, and students. Most had never been off the reservation. They grew up in traditional homes, speaking their language, living a life that had changed little in centuries. But they had also experienced the modern American world in a brutal way. Many of them were survivors of the U.S. government's boarding school system. For decades, the official policy was assimilation. The government believed that to civilize Native Americans, their culture and language had to be erased. Where children were taken from their families and sent to faraway schools. At these schools, they were forbidden from speaking their own language. If they were caught speaking Navajo, they were punished. Their mouths were washed out with soap. They were beaten. They were told their language was dirty, useless, savage. Chester Nez, one of the original 29 Code Talkers, later wrote about his experience in his book, Code Talker. He described having his mouth scrubbed with brown Fells naphtha soap for speaking Navajo. He was taught to be ashamed of who he was. And now, the same government that tried to beat the language out of them was asking them to use it to save the country. The irony was not lost on these men. They were being asked to turn their greatest source of shame into their greatest source of strength. It was a profound and complex choice, but they answered the call. They were patriots. They saw the United States as their country, and the land they were defending was the same land their ancestors had lived on for generations. Carl Gorman, another of the original 29, said they were fighting to protect their Mother Earth, our grandmother Earth. When the Marine recruiters arrived on the Navajo Nation, they did not have an easy job. They had to explain the war to people who lived a world away from the conflict. They used Navajo concepts to explain what was happening. They described the enemy as a monster who was trying to devour other nations. They spoke of the need for warriors to defend their people. This resonated with the Navajo, who have a long and proud warrior tradition. The men who enlisted were stepping into a world that was completely alien to them. They went from the quiet, open spaces of Arizona and New Mexico to the rigid, loud, and crowded world of a Marine Corps boot camp. They endured the same grueling training as every other Marine. They marched, they crawled through mud, they learned to handle weapons, and they faced racism. Other recruits who had never met a Native American called them chief or made jokes about their long hair. They were outsiders, but they were also Marines. They proved their toughness, they completed the training, and earned the respect of their fellow soldiers. They were not just Navajo anymore, they were United States Marines, and they were about to create a weapon that no one could have imagined. What did it feel like for these young men to be told the language of their parents was now a national treasure? How many of the teachers and administrators from the boarding schools ever learned that the boys they punished went on to become national heroes for the very thing they were punished for? Did the government's sudden embrace of the language feel like a cynical ploy, or a genuine, if long overdue, sign of respect? At number 15, how do you invent a new language for war in a locked room? After boot camp, the first 29 recruits were not sent to the front lines. They were taken to a classroom at Camp Elliott in San Diego. They were locked inside. They were told their mission was top secret. They could not talk about it to anyone. Their job was to turn the Navajo language into a military code. This had never been done before. They had to invent the rules themselves. The first problem was that the Navajo language had no words for modern military terms. There was no word for tank, or submarine, or battleship. They had to create a new vocabulary. They started with what they knew. They used the natural world and their own culture as inspiration. They developed a system of word association. A tank became chai dagahi, which translates to tortoise. It made sense. A tank is slow, armored, and moves across the land. A submarine became beshlo, or iron fish. A battleship was loso, well. A fighter plane was dahitihi, hummingbird, because of the sound it made. A bomber was jay, show, buzzard. They worked for 13 weeks, day and night. The list grew. Dive bomber became guinea, chicken hawk. Destroyer was kalo, shark. Minesweeper became, beaver, an animal that works with its hands in the water. They assigned Navajo words to countries. America was Nihima, our mother. Britain was Tota, between the waters. The Japanese were be na alitsosie slant-eyed. The German forces were besh bechahe iron hat for their distinctive helmets. They created a whole dictionary for war. But what about words that were not on the list? A commander might need to talk about a specific place, like Manila, or a person's name, like MacArthur. They could not create a new Navajo word for every possibility, so they devised a second, more brilliant system. They created a phonetic alphabet. They chose a Navajo word to represent each letter of the English alphabet. For the letter A, they used wul lachi, the Navajo word for aunt. For B, they used shush, which means bear. For C, they used moezi, cat. So, to spell the word navy, a code talker would say Senidal wolachi ant ake diglini victor dibe yazi yoke. An enemy listening in would first have to realize they were hearing Navajo. Then they would have to translate the words. But the translation would be gibberish, needle ant victor yoke. They would have no idea that the first letter of each word spelled out a message. By the end of their training, the first 29 had created a dictionary of 211 terms. This dictionary was memorized, it was never written down in the field. This was a critical part of its security. There was no code book for the enemy to capture. The code existed only in the minds of the code talkers. They were tested again and again. They had to be perfect. A single mistake could get people killed. They succeeded. They had built a code that was not just based on their language, it was an extension of their way of thinking. They had turned their culture into a weapon. How did they decide which word to use when there were multiple options? Were there arguments in that locked room over whether a bomber was more like a buzzard or an eagle? What creative solutions did they come up with that were rejected? And what secret, unrecorded code words did they use among themselves in the field? Number 14, could a language itself be a fortress? The Navajo language, or Din Bizad, is not like English or other European languages. Its structure is what makes it so difficult for outsiders to learn. This linguistic complexity was the foundation of the code's success. It was a natural fortress built over centuries that no enemy could penetrate. One of the most complex features is the verb. In English, the verb is a simple part of a sentence. He is going. In Navajo, the verb is the sentence. A single Navajo verb can contain the subject, the object, and details about the action itself. It can change based on who is doing the action, what is being acted upon, and how the action is happening. Linguists estimate there are hundreds of thousands of conjugations for some Navajo verbs. To an English speaker, this is almost impossible to grasp. You cannot just learn vocabulary. You have to understand a completely different way of describing the world. The sounds of the language are also a major barrier. Navajo is a tonal language. The pitch of a word can change its meaning entirely. The word bida can mean its father, its bill, or among it, depending on the tone used. There are also sounds in Navajo that do not exist in English or Japanese. Glottal stops, where the flow of air is suddenly cut off in the throat, are common. Ejective consonants, which are produced with a sharp burst of air, are also used. An untrained ear cannot even hear these sounds properly, let alone reproduce them. This made writing the language down phonetically almost impossible for the enemy. Furthermore, the language had no written form at the time. There was no standardized alphabet, no dictionary, no grammar book for an enemy intelligence officer to study. The only way to learn it was to grow up speaking it. Before the war, it is estimated that fewer than 30 non-Navajos were fluent in the language. Most of them were missionaries or traders who were not in a position to help the Axis powers. The Japanese intelligence was very good. They had linguists who could speak English, German, and many other languages, but they had no one who could speak Navajo. This is what made Philip Johnston's ideas so much better than using other tribal languages. Dr. William C. Meadows, professor of anthropology and author of The First Code Talkers, has done extensive research on the subject. He notes that German anthropologists had studied languages like Cherokee and Choctaw. The Germans even sent agents to the U.S. before the war to learn these languages. The Japanese, too, had made efforts to study Native American cultures, but Navajo remained isolated and unstudied. It was a linguistic black hole. The structure of the code itself added another layer of protection. Even if the enemy captured a Navajo speaker who was not a code talker, they would not be able to understand the messages. This was proven in the Bataan Death March in 1942. A captured Navajo soldier named Joe Kiyumiya was tortured by the Japanese. They knew he was Navajo, and they had heard the strange language on the radio. They brought him in and forced him to listen to the transmissions. He told them he could not understand a word. He was telling the truth. He heard words like Taurus and iron fish. It made no sense to him. It was military jargon disguised as everyday Navajo. The language itself was the first wall of the fortress. The code was the second. What parts of the Navajo language are so complex that even modern computers struggle to model them? Are there nuances of tone and meaning in the original code talker transmissions that we have lost forever because they were never recorded? If someone tried to create a code from a different unwritten language today, would it still be as effective in an age of artificial intelligence? Number 13. How do you build a machine out of men? The Navajo code was not a machine like the German Enigma or the Japanese Purple. It had no rotors, no plugs, no circuits. The machine was the code talker himself. His brain was the processor. His voice was the transmitter. His ears were the receiver. This human element gave the code its two greatest advantages: speed and flexibility. Consider the process for a machine-based code. An officer would write a message. A communications specialist would have to type it into the machine, which would scramble it according to a complex daily setting. This encrypted text, a string of gibberish, would then be transmitted via Morse code. On the other end, another specialist would receive the Morse code, type the gibberish into their own machine, which had to have the exact same setting, and the machine would unscramble it. The whole process, from writing the message to having a decoded version, could take 30 minutes or more. In a fast-moving battle, 30 minutes was an eternity. Now consider the Navajo process. An officer would give a message to a code talker. We need 500 pounds of explosives at grid coordinate 7B. The code talker would think for a moment. He would translate the message into the Navajo code in his head. He would pick up the radio handset and speak. Ze elk dibe yazi lamna asosimaus. The entire process could take as little as 20 seconds. This incredible speed was a massive tactical advantage. The commanders on the front lines could get real-time information. They could call in artillery strikes with pinpoint accuracy. They could warn other units of an impending attack. They could coordinate complex maneuvers involving thousands of men across miles of jungle or beach. Major Howard Connor, the signal officer for the 5th Marine Division at the Battle of Iwo Jima, famously said, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." During the first 48 hours of that battle, 6 code talkers worked around the clock. They sent and received over 800 messages. They made 0 errors. A machine-based system would have been completely overwhelmed. The code was also incredibly flexible. If a new piece of enemy equipment appeared on the battlefield, the code talkers did not have to wait for a new codebook to be printed and distributed. They could create a new word for it on the spot, they would agree on a new term, and it would instantly become part of the lexicon. The code was a living, breathing thing. It adapted to the changing conditions of the war. This human element was irreplaceable. The men were not just cogs in a machine. They had to be smart, calm under pressure, and have incredible memories. They were the machine. A machine made of culture, language, and courage. They were a biological encryption device that was faster, more reliable, and more secure than any mechanical one. If the code talkers were the hardware and the language was the operating system, what was the software that allowed them to process information so quickly under fire? How much faster could the war have been won if every division had a team of code talkers? What are the limits of human cognition that even the code talkers might have faced, and how did they overcome them? Number 12. Can you be too good at your job? The Navajo Code Talker program was so secret that at first, many of their fellow Marines did not know who they were or what they were doing. On the chaotic battlefields of the Pacific, this secrecy could be deadly. The Code Talkers looked different from the mostly white soldiers around them. They were speaking a strange language into the radio. To a Marine who was not in on the secret, a Code Talker could easily be mistaken for a Japanese soldier who had stolen a radio. There are several documented cases of friendly fire and suspicion. Some Code Talkers were captured by their own side. They were held at gunpoint, their credentials questioned. The fear was real. A nervous, battle-fatigued soldier might shoot first and ask questions later. This put the Code Talkers in a terrible position. They were fighting 2 enemies, the Japanese in front of them, and the suspicion of their own comrades around them. To protect them, the Marine Corps often assigned a bodyguard to each Code Talker. This bodyguard's official job was to protect the Code Talker. But according to some accounts, they had a second, more sinister duty. The code was the most important thing. It could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands. If a Code Talker was in danger of being captured, the bodyguard's orders were to protect the code at all costs. Many have interpreted this to mean they were to kill the code talker rather than let him be taken prisoner. Chester Nez wrote about this in his memoir. He said his bodyguard told him, "If you get captured, I'm supposed to shoot you." He then added, "I'm just kidding." But Nez was never sure if it was a joke. This highlights the immense pressure these men were under. Not only did they have to perform their duties perfectly under fire, but they also had to deal with the constant threat of being misunderstood by their own side. They were a secret weapon, but the secret itself was a danger to them. The program's success also created another problem demand. As commanders in the field saw how effective the code talkers were, they all wanted them. The initial group of 29 was not enough. The program had to be expanded. By the end of the war, over 400 Navajos had been trained as code talkers. They served in all 6 Marine divisions in the Pacific. They were at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. They were everywhere. This rapid expansion put a strain on the training program, run by men like Corporal Carl Gorman. They had to quickly train new recruits while also updating the code itself. The vocabulary grew from the original 211 words to over 600 by the end of the war. Then they had to ensure that every single code talker, from the first to the last, was perfectly trained and knew the entire dictionary by heart. The success of the program created a relentless demand that the men in charge had to struggle to meet. Their own effectiveness became their biggest challenge. How many close calls with friendly fire were never officially reported? What was the psychological toll on a bodyguard who knew he might have to kill the man he was sworn to protect? Did the rapid expansion of the program ever lead to a decline in quality or a near breach of security that we don't know about? Number 11. What makes memory a weapon? The code talkers came from an oral culture. For centuries, Navajo history, religious ceremonies, and family lineages were not written down. They were passed from one generation to the next through stories and songs. A single ceremony could require a medicine man to memorize chants and procedures that would take days to perform. This was a culture that placed a huge value on memory. The minds of the Navajo people were trained from a young age to hold vast amounts of complex information. This cultural training was the perfect preparation for their role in the war. The Navajo code was a memorized system. There were no code books in the field. A captured code book would have compromised the entire system. Instead, each of the more than 400 code talkers had the entire dictionary, with all its hundreds of terms committed to memory. They also had to know the phonetic alphabet and be able to use it to spell any word they needed. Think about the mental effort this required. They had to do this in the middle of a battle. Shells are exploding, bullets are flying, men are shouting and dying all around them. In this chaos, they had to recall a specific Navajo word for flamethrower or spell out a complex grid coordinate using the phonetic alphabet. They had to do it quickly and with perfect accuracy. Their minds had to be clear, focused, and disciplined. Their training at Camp Pendleton was designed to reinforce this. They were drilled relentlessly. They practiced sending and receiving messages until it was second nature. They were tested on the vocabulary again and again. According to the official history of the program, their final exams required them to send a sample message, receive one, and translate it, all with 100% accuracy in a very short amount of time. It was an incredible feat of memorization and mental processing under pressure. This reliance on memory also made the code incredibly secure. There was nothing for the enemy to steal. There was no machine to capture and reverse engineer. The code was intangible. It existed only in the minds of these specific men. It was a secret you could not see, touch, or steal. You could only kill the men who held it. The oral tradition of the Navajo people, a skill developed for cultural and spiritual survival, became a critical tool for military victory. It is a powerful example of how a so-called primitive skill can be superior to modern technology. The human mind, trained and focused, became the most secure encryption device in the world. The memories of these men were a weapon that no enemy could counter. Did the code talkers use traditional Navajo memory techniques, like storytelling or song, to help them learn the code? How did the stress of combat affect their memory, and what mental tricks did they use to stay focused? Are there aspects of how the human brain processes language and memory that the code talkers instinctively understood, and that modern neuroscience is only now beginning to discover? Number 10. How do you remain invisible in the middle of a war? The Navajo code talkers served on the front lines of the most brutal battles in the Pacific. They were not hidden in bunkers far from the fighting. They were right there in the thick of it. They landed on the beaches with the first waves of Marines. They slogged through jungles and crawled into foxholes. They were exposed to the same dangers as every other infantryman. They carried a rifle, and they knew how to use it. Many were wounded, many were killed, but they had an additional burden. They carried a 30-pound radio on their back. This made them a target. The enemy knew that communications were the nervous system of an army. If you could take out the radio operator, you could disrupt command and control. You could isolate units and destroy them. The radios had large antennas that made them easy to spot. The code talkers were priority targets for enemy snipers and artillery. The code talkers had to learn to be both a soldier and a technician at the same time. They had to be aware of their surroundings, ready to fight at any moment, while also concentrating on the messages coming through their headset. They often worked in pairs. One would operate the radio and transmit messages, while the other would relay messages to the commanding officer and watch for enemy soldiers. It was a job that required intense multitasking and situational awareness. The physical conditions were brutal. They operated in the suffocating heat of the jungle, in the middle of monsoons, on volcanic islands covered in black sand. The equipment was heavy and unreliable. The batteries died. The radios broke. They had to know how to fix their equipment on the fly, often while under fire. The story of the Code Talkers is not just a story about language. It is a story about incredible bravery and resilience. These men were warriors in every sense of the word. They faced the horrors of war with the same courage as any other Marine. But they did so while carrying the weight of a secret that could change the course of the war. They had to perform a complex mental task in the worst possible environment. They could not afford to make a mistake. Their role was often lonely. They were part of a Marine unit, but they were also separate. Their primary connection was to the other code talker on the other end of the radio, a man they might not even know, miles away on another part of the battlefield. They formed a network, a brotherhood, connected by radio waves and a shared secret language. They were the invisible nerve endings of the Marine Corps, transmitting vital information, connecting the brain of the command to the muscle of the front lines. They were often invisible, but they were always essential. How many times did a code talker have to drop his handset, pick up his rifle, and fight for his life in the middle of a transmission? What unrecorded acts of battlefield maintenance, like fixing a radio with a piece of wire and a prayer, kept the lines of communication open at a critical moment? What was the casualty rate for code talkers compared to regular infantrymen, and how many were specifically targeted by the enemy? Number 9. What does it mean when the enemy hears your language, but not your words? The Japanese were experts at code breaking. They were also skilled at intelligence gathering. They knew the Americans were using Native American languages for communication, but they had no idea what they were hearing when they listened to the code talkers. The sounds were unlike anything they had ever encountered. Some Japanese officers thought the Americans were speaking some kind of secret language of the sea, a code based on the sounds of fish and whales. The psychological effect of the code on the enemy cannot be overstated. War is about uncertainty and fear. The code created a profound sense of confusion and paranoia among Japanese commanders. They could hear the Americans communicating. They knew orders were being given and reports were being sent, but they had no way of knowing what was being said. It was as if the Marines were communicating by telepathy. It gave the Americans a massive psychological edge. They could operate with the confidence that their plans were secure. The Japanese had to operate with the constant fear that the enemy knew their every move. The ultimate test of the code security came with the capture of Sergeant Joe Kiyomiya. As mentioned, he was a Navajo soldier captured in the Philippines in 1942. He was not a code talker. When the Japanese military intelligence learned of his heritage, they saw a golden opportunity. They had a native speaker. They thought they had finally found the key to unlock the American code. They dragged Kiyomiya to a radio and forced him to listen to the code talker transmissions. They demanded he translate. Kiyomiya listened. He heard Navajo words, but they made no sense in a military context. He heard whale, iron fish, hummingbird, our mother. It was nonsense. He honestly told his captors that he could not understand it. He said it sounded like his language, but it was being used in a crazy way. The Japanese refused to believe him. They thought he was being defiant. They tortured him brutally, but they never got a translation because he could not give them one. He did not know the code. This incident, documented after the war, is the single best piece of evidence for the brilliance of the two-layer system. The Navajo language was the first layer of security. The code created by the first 29 was the second. You needed to know both to understand the messages. The Kiyumia case proved that just being a native Navajo speaker was not enough. The code was truly unbreakable. The enemy heard the language, but they could not hear the words. How many Japanese intelligence reports from the war mention the strange, indecipherable American radio traffic? Did the Japanese ever come close to identifying the language as Navajo? And if so, what stopped them from going further? What other desperate and incorrect theories did the Japanese have about the source of the code? Number 8. How did teamwork become a tactical advantage? The code talkers rarely worked alone. They were deployed in pairs or small teams. This structure was a key part of their effectiveness. It provided redundancy, security, and support in the heat of battle. A typical setup would involve 2 code talkers in a foxhole. One would be on the radio, sending and receiving messages. The other would be writing down the incoming messages, handing new messages to the operator, and keeping a lookout for the enemy. They were each other's backup. This teamwork was not just a military procedure, it was rooted in Navajo culture. The Navajo concept of ki emphasizes the importance of kinship, community, and solidarity. It is a belief that people are stronger and more effective when they work together. The code talkers brought this cultural value with them to the battlefield. They looked out for each other. They trusted each other completely. This bond was essential for their survival and the success of their mission. The 2-man team system also allowed for continuous operation. Transmitting and receiving under pressure was mentally and physically exhausting. The men could switch roles, giving the primary operator a chance to rest his voice and his mind. This ensured that the communication link was always open, 24 hours a day if necessary. During major operations like the Battle of Iwo Jima, they worked in shifts, sleeping in their foxholes next to their radios, ready to transmit at a moment's notice. The teamwork extended beyond the foxhole. The entire network of over 400 code talkers was a single, coordinated team. A message sent from a beachmaster on Saipan could be relayed through a command ship to a forward air controller coordinating an airstrike. All of these links were Navajo code talkers. They were a seamless communication network. They all spoke the same language, both literally and figuratively. They understood the nuances of the code and the pressures of their job. This shared understanding made their communication incredibly efficient. There was no need for the constant repetition and clarification that plagued other forms of military communication. They understood each other perfectly. This trust and efficiency, born from a shared culture and a shared mission, was a powerful tactical advantage. It allowed the Marine Corps to operate with a speed and coordination that baffled their opponents. The Code Talker network was more than just a series of radio operators. It was a living, interconnected organism. Were there specific pairs of Code Talkers who became famous within the Corps for their speed and efficiency? How did they resolve disagreements about a word or translation in the middle of a battle? What unspoken signals and understandings developed between partners who had faced combat together? Number 7. How do you keep a secret for 25 years? When the war ended in 1945, the Code Talkers returned home. But they did not return as celebrated heroes. They returned as ordinary soldiers, with one major difference. They were carrying a secret. Before they were discharged, they were taken into a room and told that their mission was still top secret. They were ordered not to speak about it. Not to anyone. Not to their parents, their wives, their children. Not to other veterans. They were to act as if it never happened. The military's reasoning was simple. The code had been so successful, so completely unbreakable, that they might need to use it again. The Cold War was beginning. New conflicts loomed on the horizon. The Navajo Code was still a valuable military asset, and so the men who had saved countless lives with their words were sworn to silence. This silence had a profound impact on their lives. They had experienced the trauma of war, but they could not talk about it. Other veterans could share their stories with family and friends, a process that is often crucial for healing. The Code Talkers could not. They could not explain why they had nightmares. They could not explain what they did in the war. They could not take pride in their unique and vital contribution. They simply had to bury it. For more than 2 decades, they kept their promise. They went back to their lives on the reservation. They became farmers, artists, tribal leaders, and laborers. They raised families. They lived quiet lives. Their neighbors and even their own children had no idea that these men were heroes. There were no parades for them. No public recognition. Their story was officially classified. It was not until 1968 that the program was finally declassified. The secret was out. But even then, the story did not become widely known. It took years for historians and the public to understand the full scope of what these men had done. The first book on the subject was not published until 1969. The first official recognition came slowly. The long silence is a crucial and often overlooked part of the Code Talker story. It shows the incredible discipline and sense of duty these men possessed. They had served their country in war, and they continue to serve it in peace by keeping its secrets. But it also represents a great injustice. They were denied the honor and recognition they deserved for decades. They were heroes forced to live in the shadows. What was the emotional cost of this decades-long silence for the men and their families? How many code talkers passed away before the story was declassified, taking their personal experiences to the grave? Did the government do anything to monitor the veterans during the period of secrecy to ensure the code remained safe? Number 6. Why is a story sometimes more powerful than a medal? After the declassification in 1968, the story of the Code Talkers began to emerge. Piece by piece, veterans started to talk. Journalists and historians took an interest, but official government recognition was still slow to come. For years, their contribution was largely a footnote in the history of the war. The Code Talkers themselves did not seek fame or glory. That was not their way. But as they grew older, they and their families began to push for their story to be told. They wanted their children and grandchildren to know what they had done. They wanted their unique role in history to be properly acknowledged. The real turning point came much later. In 2000, Senator Jeff Bingaman of New Mexico introduced a bill to award the Congressional Gold Medal, the nation's highest civilian honor, to the original 29 Code Talkers. The bill was passed, and on July 26, 2001, President George W. Bush presented the medals to the 4 surviving members of the original 29. The families of the other 25 received the medals posthumously. It was a powerful and emotional ceremony more than 55 years after the end of the war. All the other Code Talkers were later awarded the Congressional Silver Medal. This official recognition was important. It was a formal acknowledgement from the United States government of their debt to these men. But for many, the true recognition came not from the medals, but from the telling of the story. The publication of books like Chester Nez's memoir, the creation of documentaries, and the inclusion of their story in school curriculums have had a lasting impact. The story of the Code Talkers is more than just a war story. It is a story about cultural survival. It is a story about how a language that was once suppressed became a source of national strength. It is a story that challenges our ideas about what constitutes a weapon and who can be a hero. It has become a source of immense pride for the Navajo people and for all Native Americans. It is a powerful example of how indigenous knowledge and culture can have value in the modern world. The medals are symbols, but the story itself is a living thing. It is told and retold, inspiring new generations. It ensures that the legacy of these men is not just about a secret code, but about the enduring power of their culture and their language. The story has become their most lasting monument. Why did it take over half a century for the government to officially honor these men? How did the perception of the Code Talkers change within the Navajo Nation itself after the story became public? What parts of their story are still not widely known or understood, even today? Number 5, could the code be recreated today? The success of the Navajo Code was a product of a specific time and place. It relied on a unique set of circumstances that would be very difficult, if not impossible, to replicate in the 21st century. First, the key was the linguistic isolation of Navajo. In the 1940s, it was an unwritten language spoken by a relatively small group of people in a remote part of the country. There were no academic studies, no dictionaries, no Rosetta Stone software for the enemy to use. Today, the world is far more interconnected. Linguists have documented nearly every language on the planet. Even the most obscure languages are often studied and recorded. It would be much harder to find a language with the same level of isolation that Navajo had during the war. Second, the men themselves were unique. They came from an oral tradition that honed their memories in a way that is rare in a modern, literate society. They possessed a deep, intuitive understanding of their language that could not be taught in a classroom. The boarding school experience, as terrible as it was, had a paradoxical effect. It made them fluent in English, which was a requirement for the job. This generation of men, who were products of both the traditional Navajo world and the modern American one, was a unique human resource. Third, the technology of the time was a factor. Communications were primarily voice-based, over radio. This played to the strengths of a spoken code. Today, a huge amount of military communication is data-based. It is text, images, and video. While a spoken code could still be used for voice communications, it would not be able to secure the vast amounts of digital data that are transmitted on a modern battlefield. The nature of code breaking has also changed. Today, it is dominated by computers and artificial intelligence. A human-based code would be up against powerful algorithms that can analyze patterns in speech, tone, and frequency. While the complexity of a language like Navajo would still be a formidable barrier, it is an open question whether it could withstand a sustained assault by modern computational linguistics. The Navajo code was the perfect weapon for its time. It was a brilliant low-tech solution to a high-tech problem. It succeeded because it was based on the one thing the enemy could not replicate: the human mind and its connection to culture. It is a reminder that sometimes the most powerful solutions are not the most technologically advanced ones. But it is also a legacy of a moment in history that has likely passed. If a similar program were attempted today, which language would be chosen and why? Could an artificial intelligence be trained to be a code talker? And would it be as secure? What are the vulnerabilities of our modern, technology-based encryption that a human-based system like the Navajo code does not have? Number 4, did their culture make them better warriors? The Navajo have a concept called hozo. It is a complex idea with no simple English translation. It means balance, harmony, beauty, and order. To live in hozo is to walk in beauty, to be in harmony with oneself, with the community, and with the natural world. War is the opposite of hozo. It is chaos, violence, and disharmony. When the code talkers returned from the war, many of them suffered from what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. They had seen and done terrible things. Their sense of hozo was broken. In Navajo tradition, a warrior who returns from battle must go through a ceremony to cleanse themselves of the experience of war. This is called the WWII ceremony. It is a multi-day ritual designed to restore the warrior to a state of balance and harmony. Many code talkers underwent this ceremony. It was a way for them to process their trauma within their own cultural framework. It acknowledged the spiritual wounds of war, not just the physical ones. It allowed them to separate themselves from the violence they had witnessed and participated in, and to be welcomed back into the community as whole people again. This traditional form of healing was, for many, more effective than the psychological services offered by the government at the time. The warrior tradition itself also played a role. The Navajo have stories of great warriors like Nai Monster Slayer, one of the hero twins of their creation story. These stories provided a model for how a warrior should behave with courage, skill, and a sense of purpose. The code talkers saw themselves as being part of this tradition. They were not just fighting for the United States, they were fighting to protect their people and their land from a great evil. This gave their service a deep sense of meaning. The very language they used was tied to their worldview. The code words they chose, tortoise, ironfish, our mother, were rooted in their relationship with the natural world and their community. Their weapon was not a foreign object. It was an extension of their own identity. This may have given them a sense of purpose and psychological resilience that other soldiers lacked. They were not just fighting a war, they were walking a warrior's path, guided by the principles and traditions of their people. How many code talkers participated in the WWII ceremony, and how did it affect their post-war lives? Did the use of their sacred language for the violent purposes of war create a spiritual conflict for any of the men? In what other ways did their cultural beliefs provide a source of strength or challenge on the battlefield? Number 3, was the code truly perfect? The Navajo code has a legendary status. It is often described as unbreakable and perfect, and in all the ways that matter, it was. It was never broken by the enemy. It was transmitted with, nearly 100% accuracy. It was a decisive factor in many American victories. But was it truly without any flaws? From a purely technical standpoint, the code did have some potential vulnerabilities, though none were ever exploited. The first was the phonetic alphabet. Because the Navajo words for the letters were always the same, e.g., Wolachi always meant a dedicated enemy cryptanalyst could have, in theory, noticed the repetition. If they recorded enough messages, they might have been able to identify the words that represented letters and begin to piece together the alphabet. This is a classic method for breaking substitution ciphers. To counter this, the code talkers actually developed a more complex alphabet system with multiple Navajo words for frequently used letters like E, T, and A. This would make a frequency analysis much more difficult. However, the core vulnerability of a fixed substitution system remained. The real defense was that the enemy never even got to that stage. They were never able to isolate the individual words from the stream of sound, let alone identify them as part of an alphabet code. Another potential issue was human error. The men were human, they were operating under extreme stress. It is possible that mistakes were made, that a word was misheard, or a translation was slightly off. However, the veterans themselves insist that their accuracy rate was essentially perfect. The teamwork system, with one man sending and another confirming, likely helped to catch any potential errors before they became a problem. The consequences of a mistake, like calling in an artillery strike on the wrong coordinates, were so catastrophic that the men were trained to an exceptionally high standard of precision. The greatest flaw in the program was not in the code itself, but in its secrecy. Because the program was so secret, it could not be widely implemented. There were only a few hundred code talkers. While they were incredibly effective where they were used, their impact was limited to the Marine Corps in the Pacific. The Army in Europe, for example, did not have a similar program on the same scale. The secrecy that made the code so secure also limited its strategic reach. It was a perfect weapon, but it was a weapon that could not be mass-produced. What minor errors or near misses occurred that were never recorded in the official histories? Were there ever moments when the code talkers had to improvise so much that they worried the message would be misunderstood by the receiving operator? If the Japanese had captured a code talker alive, along with a list of the coded vocabulary, could they have broken it, or was the syntax of the language itself still too great a barrier? Number 2, what is the price of a secret? The legacy of the Navajo code talkers is one of triumph and pride, but is also a story tinged with sadness and injustice. The price of the secret they carried was paid over a lifetime. For 25 years, they were unable to share their greatest accomplishment. This created a strange and isolating experience. They had been part of one of the most important and secret operations of the war, but they had to pretend it never happened. This silence denied them the simple human need for acknowledgement. It also meant they were often overlooked when it came to veterans' benefits. Because the nature of their work was classified, they struggled to get proper treatment for the psychological trauma they had endured. How could you explain your trauma when you were forbidden from talking about what caused it? The delayed recognition was another part of the price. By the time the Congressional Gold Medals were awarded in 2001, most of the original 29 had passed away. Their families received the medals on their behalf. While this was a meaningful gesture, it was a posthumous honor for the men who did the most to create the code. They never got to see their country officially thank them for what they had done. There is also the profound irony at the heart of their story. The U.S. government, which had for so long tried to destroy Navajo culture and language, was ultimately saved by it. This is a difficult and uncomfortable truth. The code talkers were patriots who served a country that had not always treated their people with respect or fairness. They fought for freedom abroad while their own people at home often faced poverty, discrimination, and the continued threat of cultural assimilation. The story of the code talkers forces us to confront this complex history. It is a story of American ingenuity and courage, but it is also a story about the resilience of an indigenous culture in the face of incredible pressure. The price of the secret was silence and delayed justice. But the ultimate legacy of the code talkers is that their secret is now out. Their story is now part of the American story. And it is a story that challenges us, even today, to think about the true meaning of patriotism, service, and the debt we owe to all our heroes. If the program had not been kept secret, how would the lives of the code talkers have been different? Does the delayed recognition fully repay the debt owed to these men and their families? What lessons from the code talker experience have the military and the government failed to learn? Number 1, was it the language or was it the men? This is the final and most important question. What was the true source of the code talkers' power? Was it the unique, complex, and unwritten nature of the Navajo language? Or was it the intelligence, courage, and cultural strength of the young men who spoke it? The answer is that it was both. The two are inseparable. The code would have been impossible without the language, but the language would have been useless without the men. The Navajo language was the raw material. It was a gift of history, a linguistic fortress that had been built over centuries. Its tonal qualities, its complex verb structure, and its isolation made it the perfect candidate for a code. It was an accident of history that such a perfect cryptographic tool existed, but it was the men who turned that raw material into a weapon. It was the first 29 who, in that locked room at Camp Elliott, had the creativity to build a code on top of their language. They used their cultural knowledge to create a vocabulary for war that was both poetic and practical. Iron fish is not just a random substitution, it is a description. It shows a way of seeing the world that is unique to their culture. It was the men who had the mental discipline to memorize hundreds of code words. It was their background in an oral tradition that gave them the mental muscles to perform this feat. It was the men who had the courage to use this code on the front lines to transmit messages while under fire, to face death every day. It was their resilience, their teamwork, and their sense of duty that made the system work. The Navajo Code Talker program was a perfect fusion of culture and conflict, of man and mission. It was not a technology, it was a human system. It relied on memory, not a machine. It relied on cultural understanding, not a mathematical algorithm. It is a story that reminds us that the most powerful weapons are not always made of steel. Sometimes they are made of words. And sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones whose voices were, for the longest time, never heard. What if the Marine Corps had chosen another complex language, but the recruits did not have the same cultural background of memory and resilience? Would it have been as successful? If we look at the code talkers as a human technology, what does that tell us about the potential that lies hidden in other cultures and languages around the world? Is the ultimate lesson of the code talkers that the most powerful resource a nation has is not its technology, but the diversity and unique skills of its people?